The conversation
why should I, as a female, be forced to get changed in front of a male?
Because this is, again, the conversation about where you view gender and somebody's right to self-autonomy.
I've got no interest in how someone views their own gender. My question was, why should I, as a female, be forced to get undressed in front of a male?
This exchange gets to the heart of a debate that politicians and institutions have spent years struggling to resolve. When one person's claim to gender identity collides with another person's expectation of privacy, who is expected to compromise? Michelle Dewberry puts that question in the clearest possible terms. Whatever someone believes about transgender identity, she argues that women should not be required to surrender single-sex changing spaces simply because institutions have adopted a different definition of woman. And when Samuel is repeatedly asked to explain why a biological female should have to undress in the presence of a biological male, the discussion suddenly becomes much harder than repeating slogans about inclusion. That tension between individual identity and competing rights is what makes this exchange worth watching. Before we roll the clip, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Debate Central, and turn on notifications. Now let's get into it.
Welcome. Now, I do just want to tell you about this. A new report out says that children in England are 50 times more likely to suffer from so-called gender distress compared to over a decade ago, according to NHS records. In 2011, just 200 people under the age of 18 identified as transgender or struggled with gender dysphoria. But by 2021, it was up to gone 10,000. And I would argue that when they recalculate it post-2021, the numbers will be through the roof. What do you think to all this, Charlie Downs?
Well, this language that's used in the headlines talking about this story of gender distress, I think is basically code for mental illness. And it's no secret that, my generation and below are, experience unprecedented levels of mental illness. This, again, is something I've spoken about on the show before. What I think this comes from is, among other things, a lack of belonging. And I think that is a result of a number of things, including bad education and ideologically driven education about the history of this country, the idea that we should be ashamed of our nation, ashamed of our various identitarian credentials, which is why the left offer young people the identity politics that they do, along the lines of race, along the lines of sex, along the lines of sexuality, and so on. And that is part of this story. But I think that
how does someone being taught, I don't know, Brits are all racist or whatever it is that they get taught, or some would think that they get taught, how does that make a boy then think, actually, I'm a girl?
Because what that does is it deracinates the person in question. It makes them feel as though they are not part of a people. And if they are, they should be ashamed of that people. And so they go searching for identity in other places, like in gender or in race or whatever else. But I think that really those are poor replacements for what would in ordinary times be, a sense of community, a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of place. And I think it's the lack of those things that so many young people experience that drives them towards, again, what's described here as gender distress. And I just think that the conversation about this is wrong. We are talking about downstream consequences of a more fundamental issue, which is that we've behaved as if living under this kind of liberal moral paradigm that we have since the end of the Second World War, we've behaved as if individual self-expression is the most important possible thing. The idea that you can't judge people and so forth, and that your own identity, self-defined identity, is the most important thing. But what I think that does to people is it makes them a little bit loopy.
Well, no, I can't really say I agree with any of that. What I would say, though, if we want to talk about, I don't know about the lack of British identity or whatever, but what I do think creates a hostile environment for trans people, and why so many younger people particularly may suffer with gender dysphoria, is because of the climate of which they live in, where you have political, media and public figures demonizing them. I think the conversation very often about trans people descends immediately into the gutter and removes the dignity and justice that these people deserve. Just like us, trans people want and deserve housing, education, jobs, opportunities, but so often are they derided in debates as being deviant, as being wrong in some way and not supported. I think the number...
Well, hang on, some of these fellas that go around dressed as women with their, their fake bits in their bras, they are deviants, quite frankly.
I don't know who you're referring to.
Well, there's a condition, what's it called? I'm probably going to get...
Autogynephilia?
Yeah, that. where, sorry if you've got children listening or if you're a sensitive disposition, where some men actually get sexually aroused by the thought of themselves as women in women's stuff.
Right. Well, whilst I'm sure those people do exist, I can imagine that's an extremely tiny minority. But trans people have always existed. Look, historically, back through, go back as far as ancient Greece, ancient Rome, whereas obviously there's not so much the surgical sort of changes people can have these days. Gender dysphoria has long existed. It's in, as I said, mythology. It's in Shakespeare's plays. It's through literature, through the centuries. Now we're at a point of a greater understanding and what should be a greater acceptance of trans people. And unfortunately, many, as I said, in the government and in the media haven't caught up with that time and have made this country a particularly difficult place for transgender people to exist, essentially. I mean, it's worth noting as well, in the United States and in this country, about 50% of trans people have self-harmed and a similar amount have actually attempted suicide. And I think that Charlie makes a point about mental health and trans people, but I don't at all see transgender as a mental health condition. I just think they're extremely vulnerable because of the way that society has developed a hard shell which excludes them in any conversation and removes their dignity.
What I would say, Sam, very quickly, like the climate and nature bill that we were just talking about, this narrative that you're kind of building here, that trans people are somehow uniquely beset upon by society at large, I don't think is true. Because I think if you go into any of the kind of institutions of power in our society, whether that is the government itself or the civil service or an Amazon HR department or a media company or anything else, and you listed off the opinions that you've just given, you would find almost unanimous approval. Because like the climate and nature thing, the trans thing is also an elite project. It's something that has been picked up by power and centred in the mainstream consciousness, despite the fact that this is a tiny, vanishingly small minority of people. With that being said, I agree with you that we shouldn't be deriding these people on an individual basis. I think it's in very poor taste to attack people on the basis of their trans identity. With that being said, I still sort of say that it is an expression of mental illness, because what else can it be? If you are born a male and you are biologically a male, then you can't. It's physically and spiritually impossible to become a female, right? And so in the same way that you wouldn't tell a schizophrenic that there are men in dark suits following them around and that there are bugs in their home and cameras in their walls and so on, you don't tell a male who believes he's a female that he is a female. That doesn't have that person's best interests at heart. What you're doing is you are buying into, supporting and enabling their delusion, which I think is why you see so much what you've just said about self-harm, suicide and so on. I don't think you help these people by supporting these things.
What I will say there, Charlie, is I think that you can't on one hand say, come out against the derision of trans people and then continue to refer to them as being mentally ill.
But that's not an insult. That's a statement of fact.
Right. What I would say to that is that, I mean, yes, trans people factually are absolutely and very often in the mainstream media derided, as you said, as being deviant, as being...
By whom? Who are we talking about here? Because the mainstream media, I don't think say that. I think the mainstream media say the kind of things that you've been saying about about trans rights and so on.
I don't think you can honestly look someone in the eye, look at the headlines of the Daily Mail, the Express, the Sun, and tell me that trans people get a fair trial ever.
But what about, what about the New York Times?
People in the media literally making up hypothetical situations for which to demonize trans people with. What if someone does this? What if someone does that? And it often comes into the conversation of protecting.
Who sits there and goes, "What if someone does this?"
When we talk about the changing rooms debate is a perfect example of this. The conversation around
why should I, as a female, be forced to get changed in front of a male?
Because this is, again, the conversation about where you view gender and somebody's right to self-autonomy.
I've got no interest in how someone views their own gender. My question was, why should I, as a female, be forced to get undressed in front of a male?
But if we're referring to a trans woman, then that is a woman.
No, a trans woman is a biological male. So I'm asking you again, why should I, as a female, be forced to get undressed in front of a biological male?
Right, but if somebody has a gender,
answer
for example...
that question.
But nobody's making you do that, Michelle.
Yes, you do. There's cases going through the courts at the moment. I can think of one such case in the NHS where some nurses are taking action because they were forced to share a changing room with a gender-neutral changing room where there was what you call a trans woman, i.e. a biological male, using those facilities. So yeah, it actually does happen.
Right,
so I ask you again, why should I, as a biological female, be forced to share and get undressed in front of a biological male?
No. I will say trans men are men, trans women are women. That is my opinion, and I think that we need to respect
So we haven't answered it. So basically what you're saying is I, as a biological female, have to get changed in front of some fella because you say the label is...
That transgender people are... Do you think that trans people exist? Like,
I think that what you call a transgender woman absolutely exists. I don't think it's a figment of your imagination, but I think that they are categorically, biologically male. So therefore, they cannot and should not be able to access female-only spaces. Lots of women like me do not want to have to get dressed and all the rest of it in front of biological men. Yeah. This is not a controversial view. We have single-sex spaces for a reason. We have an epidemic of male violence against women and girls. We've fought hard to get our single-sex spaces. We deserve those single-sex spaces. Those single-sex spaces are often responsible for keeping us safe. And many of us, and there's women that will disagree with me, and I respect that, but many of us do not want biological men in our spaces, our private single-sex spaces, and nor should we have to have them there just in order to satisfy other people's descriptions.
Right, well, I suppose we're going to have to agree to disagree there, Michelle, but what
but we always have to agree to disagree, but it's not you that then has to get changed in front of a man.
Right, but
you would, because you're in that man's changing room, but you get...
And this is exactly why this debate keeps resurfacing, no matter how many politicians, corporations, or media institutions try to declare it settled. The moment you move away from abstract language about identity and inclusion, you run straight into the question of competing rights. And once that happens, slogans stop being enough. Michelle's challenge was simple, but it carried a lot of weight. If a biological woman does not consent to undressing in front of a biological male, why should her objection automatically be treated as less important than someone else's gender identity? That is not a theoretical question. It goes directly to privacy, dignity, and the purpose of single-sex spaces in the first place. Samuel's response was to return to the position that trans women are women, but that phrase does not resolve the conflict Michelle was describing. It simply restates one side of it. The real issue is what happens when that belief is applied in a way that changes the rules for everyone else. And that is where this conversation becomes politically significant. For years, a lot of institutions have acted as though inclusion only ever creates one moral obligation: affirm the person asking to be included. But public policy is rarely that simple. Rights overlap, interest conflict, boundaries matter, and government, employers, hospitals, schools, and public bodies have to make rules that work not just for one group, but for everyone affected by them. That means women's concerns cannot just be waved away as prejudice because they are inconvenient to the preferred narrative. Michelle made that point forcefully. She was not arguing that transgender people should be denied jobs, housing, education, or basic civil protections. She was asking whether those protections should extend to overriding sex-based privacy in intimate spaces. Those are different questions, and pretending they are the same only makes the debate more dishonest. There's also a broader credibility problem here for the media and political class. When people hear trans rights, many of them support the principle that transgender people should be treated with dignity and protected from abuse. But when the conversation shifts to changing rooms, prisons, sports, or medical treatment for children, public opinion becomes far more complicated. That tells you something important. Most people are capable of holding two thoughts at once. They can believe transgender people deserve protection from cruelty and discrimination, and they can also believe that biological sex matters in some contexts. That is not extremism. It is an attempt to balance competing realities. The danger comes when institutions refuse to acknowledge that distinction and instead portray every objection as hatred. Because once people feel that, ordinary questions are being morally condemned rather than answered. Trust begins to collapse. And when trust collapses, the discussion gets uglier on all sides. This is why Michelle's persistence mattered. She kept dragging the conversation back from general principles to actual consequences. Who changes where? Whose privacy takes priority? Who is expected to compromise and why? Those questions deserve direct answers. The bigger issue here is not whether Samuel was polite or whether Michelle was forceful. It is whether the position being defended can survive when tested against real-world examples. Political ideas are easy to support when they remain abstract. The real test comes when they produce consequences for somebody else. And this is where conservatives have an opportunity to make a stronger argument than simply shouting about woke ideology. The better case is about consistency, boundaries, and equal consideration. If every person's dignity matters, then women's dignity matters too. If privacy matters, then it cannot disappear the moment it conflicts with a fashionable political theory. That is the standard voters are increasingly applying. So the question after this exchange is not whether transgender people exist or whether they deserve rights. Of course they do. The question is whether recognizing those rights requires women to give up protections based on biological sex. Michelle's answer was clearly no. Samuel never really gave a convincing explanation for why it should be yes. And that is the unresolved political fault line this debate exposed. Let me know what you think in the comments. Did Michelle win the argument by forcing the conversation back to practical consequences? Or do you think Samuel's position still offers the better balance? If you enjoyed the breakdown, like the video, subscribe to Debate Central, and I'll see you in the next one.